Hey, Facebook friends, welcome to another round of Pup Theology. I'm with my friend Pastor Chad from the Arsenal Church. We're live at the Arsenal Church right now in this wonderful studio that he's been providing Pup Theology for the last couple of months now that we've had to social distance and take all of our Pup Theologies online, which reminds us you can go back anytime to watch any previous Pup Theology on our Facebook page, on our YouTube channel. You can watch past episodes with Max Lucado or with Black Outside with Alex Bailey or with the superintendent of SAFC School District. We have great Pup Theologies in the past, and you can watch that anytime, again, on our Facebook page. Pastor Chad, how you doing?
Doing all right, man.
This is the first time I think we've done it. Like, we've done Pup Theology before, but through the computer screen. This is the first time live in the studio.
Yeah, definitely.
We're trying our best to social distance, and we're trying to take that stuff seriously. But Derek Webb will be joining us in a few minutes, live from Nashville, Tennessee. He's getting set up right now, but we really wanted to discuss what's been going on in San Antonio. Next week, for Pup Theology, we have a great activist called Antonio Lee. He's been leading some of the protests, peaceful protests that me and you have both been at, and I think the one through downtown from Blue Star and other protests around Travis Park in downtown San Antonio. And he's a great guy. He's part of a group called Young Ambitious Activists.
Right.
And they've been doing great work to support Black Lives Matter and a lot of social change needed, not only in San Antonio, but across the nation. So that's what's been kind of going on. How have you enjoyed what's kind of been happening the last few weeks in downtown? What have you come to learn in this tough time?
Yeah, I think for me, it's been a ton of learning and unlearning. And we live downtown, so we're here in Southtown, and so we're close by. I mean, you're a couple blocks from us, and so even if we're not out at the protest or walking around, like we hear the helicopters that are flying around, so you know something's going on downtown. But yeah, we've gone to a couple of protests. My wife's gone to more than I have recently. She was just at one the other day that was, I don't think it was Young Ambitious Activists, but it was another group that was like Gen Z led, like all teenage or youth led protests, which, march, and it was super cool. Her and the kids went. We went to the one that you went to, that walked through Southtown. It was super cool, like just to march in that and to listen and to learn, and then also to see like our Southtown neighbors. I know like the Friendly Spot was like handing out waters right in front of their spot and stuff. Sure. So that was super neat. That was cool.
Hey, yeah. And really, we're really here to support Black Lives Matter in San Antonio. I've been really, it's Travis Park Church, or right next to Travis Park, which has been this epicenter of many of the protests. And we're just here to listen and learn and really challenge us and to really repent for a lot of the mistakes that we have made as a church. And not only at Travis Park, but, the churches all throughout San Antonio that have kind of taken a blind eye to many of the generations before us. So Derek Webb is live with us. So again, that's next week. Antonio Lee, an activist with Young Ambitious Activists and the Black Lives Matter movement here in San Antonio. That's next week, Antonio
awesome.
Lee. But Derek Webb is with us live from Nashville. We're going to pull him up right now. I can do this here. Derek, how are you?
Hey, how are you?
Can we hear him?
Do you hear me okay?
I can hear you.
Great. Man, it's great to see you. I'm sorry I'm running a few minutes late here, but it's great to be with you guys.
Thank you. Derek has been a good friend to me for many years. I first learned about Derek Webb when I was in high school in the Woodlands, Texas.
Wow.
Bob Swan, one of my great mentors in my life in ministry, would bring in Caedmon's Call to play at the Woodlands United Methodist Church for various events and concerts and worship nights. And that's when I first learned about Derek. But I got to know Derek in 2004 when he came to my ranch and played a house show when he became an independent artist. And he started a new CD. He had a new CD called She Must and Shall Go Free. Mm-hmm. And then turned that into a house show and then started doing more independent albums when he left Caedmon's Call. So we're glad you're with us, Derek.
Oh, it's a pleasure. I mean, anytime you call with an idea, I'm always like, when and where? Every time, always.
And Derek was just with us in San Antonio in January when we had Dream Week. Pastor Chad was at that event.
Yep.
And
awesome.
He played an opening act And then he had his own house show as well. So Derek's been a part of Pup Theology in the past, and now he's with us live because of social distancing. How is your family right now? Are you doing well in Nashville?
We're doing fine. Nashville is, I think, probably. I don't know that we're more extreme one way or the other than most cities right now, but we're all doing fine. You know, my wife and I both play music, and so. You know, we're both home unexpectedly off the road and things like that, but we've, you know, we're creative types. And so we've tried to get creative in the last handful of months, and both her band and I as a solo artist have both been doing long series of online shows. I'm actually doing one tomorrow night. I do them maybe every Thursday night. And
sure.
So a lot of live streaming stuff, a lot of, we're just kind of adapting to it and starting to figure out the rest of the year and next year in terms of how we're going to start to slowly and safely kind of get back with some folks and play some music and stuff like that. But we're doing okay, though. All things considered, we are. Yeah.
And that link for your show tomorrow is on our comments. And if you have any questions for Derek, you can post those on YouTube or Facebook. We'll see those things pop up on StreamYard. We'll ask those questions. So if you have any questions for Derek about his music or his faith journey or anything, he really will share about anything.
I will.
And don't be afraid to ask those comments. And so your new album is called Targets, and you're doing the entire album tomorrow night. Tell us about that.
Yeah. Oh, I really appreciate you mentioning it. Yeah. So the new record, Targets. Yeah, tomorrow night, live on Facebook, 8 o'clock Central Time. I'm going to play through the whole record, and I over the years have made a lot of different kinds of music. I've not really stuck to a style. I've made very acoustic things. And record to record, I try to produce them in such a way that sounds like the content. And the Targets record is a joyously defiant or defiantly joyous album about what's on the other side of hard things, what's on the other side of grief and deconstruction sometimes and things like that. And the previous record was called Fingers Crossed, and it was kind of a document of my going through that big audit of all the presumptions that I had carried for 30 plus years about spirituality and invisible things and unknowable things, and deconstructing some of the certainty I had about some of that was the Fingers Crossed record. And it was a heavy, sad record. And then the Targets record was about what I found on the other side and kind of finding everything I lost on the previous record. And so it's a very loud, very rock and roll record. And I'm going to, I'm going to play the whole thing on Facebook tomorrow night. So I hope people will tune in for that.
All right, that's great. And I do want to speak a little bit that we have not spoken much about your deconstruction of your faith. We have a little bit when you were here in San Antonio, but that's something I think that a lot of people at Pup Theology will find interesting, especially those who watch it later. So again, you can share this video. You can watch it later with us on Facebook and on YouTube. So now, when I first met you in your right after Caedmon's call, you're really into Reformed, like Presbyterian theology.
Yes.
I think maybe through the Presbyterian Church of America. Is that branch of
PCA?
Yeah,
sure.
So tell us how you got involved in the PCA Church. You grew up. Tell us a little bit about that, and maybe before that, where you grew up. I think United Methodist in Houston, Texas. So tell us a little bit about your faith journey, and specifically what led you to the PCA denomination.
Sure. So I did grow up United Methodist, and so my dad, when he grew up, was raised Catholic. My mom grew up Baptist, and so I think they compromised with Methodist. I think that was kind of their compromise. So they took my brother and I to the Methodist church. And they weren't especially, they weren't like super devout. It was just kind of our practice. I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee in the South. And so our practice was to be involved in church and go to church and that sort of thing. And so, I grew up with that. I was confirmed at 13 in the United Methodist Church. I went through all the camps and all the whatever. And then in my 20s, my early 20s is when some friends and I in Houston started the band Caedmon's Call in Houston. And that was formed, the other guy who played guitar and sang lead opposite me, Cliff Young, who's still a great pal of mine, his dad was the pastor of this giant Southern Baptist church in Houston called Second Baptist Church, and giant kind of mega church.
Sure.
So that kind of became my new stomping ground for a lot of years, because that was kind of our home. That was kind of our home church or whatever. And so I spent 10 years or so mostly hanging around that place. Although I did go there, but I also kind of worked there in those early years a little bit before Caedmon's took off. His dad.
I'm repping the Houston hat just for you, Derek.
Love it. Yeah, his dad gave me a job at the church while I needed some money before the band got off the ground, and then eventually that took off, and so we were doing that. And then, but that was kind of our home church for a while. That's how I wound up in the Baptist Southern as an unexpected Southern Baptist. And then when I moved to Nashville, and that would have been about 20 years ago, in about 2000, I found my way. I got mixed up with a group of folks in a little music deal called Indelible Grace, and it was basically some musicians who were reworking very old hymns to new tunes, to new music, and they made several volumes of these Indelible Grace records, and so I got kind of pulled into that community a little bit by way at that time of marriage and mutual friends, and so wound up writing some of the songs on some of the Indelible Grace records, rewrote some hymns, and these hymns were just text. I mean, people don't realize, Gadsby's or in a lot of these old hymn books, there are thousands of hymns, none of which had original music, because that wouldn't have made any sense at that time. It was, they would have, 3 or 4 or 5 common melodies, common tunes, and then and all the people who were writing hymns were writing them to one of those meters, and so you could basically sing any one of the 1,000 hymns in the hymn book without ever having heard it before. You could say, all right, we're going to sing hymn 431 to melody, to tune 4.
Exactly.
And that's why a lot of old hymns, you hear them and one person says, oh, that's Come Thou Fount. And another person says, no, it's not, that's this. Because they grew up singing different words to the same melody. That's neither of those songs. Those are both, so there were all these, pretty beautiful hymns, none of which ever had original music. And so we would dig through those old hymn books and write original tunes to a lot of the songs. So I just kind of got roped in and mixed up with that, and that was being led, the Indelible Grace kind of movement or whatever was being led by a guy who was the college pastor for one of the colleges here in Nashville. It was a PCA. What's it called? I forget the name of the PCA college ministry right now because it's been so long. I kind of really love that. I can't remember.
RUF is what it's called.
Reformed University Fellowship. Yeah, RUF.
Yeah.
So he was the RUF pastor at one of the colleges here in Nashville, and he was the one who kind of headed up this Indelible Grace thing. And so I just kind of backed in to the PCA all of a sudden. Now, to be fair, I had studied, you're right, I'd gotten into Reformed theology and had studied that, and I had a lot of friends and mentors who were into that and got me into that. And a lot of friends actually in the Southern Baptist denomination who were subversively teaching a lot of liturgical and very conservative Reformed kind of stuff, and Calvin and Luther and all that. So Augustine, and so I felt very at home in the PCA for that reason, because they tend to be pretty Reformed in their tradition and whatever. And so I spent a decent amount of time in that situation, and then wound up, before I kind of worked my way out of identifying as an evangelical Christian, I had actually really liked the Episcopal Church. I had very liturgical, and there's some Anglican. Actually, I should say Anglican, because actually the church that I was going to was an Anglican church, and it was but it was a plant or a spinoff or a break from an Episcopal church here in Nashville, and they were Anglican. But then the thing you have to remember is, all this time I was kind of a professional Christian, because I was making Christian music, which is actually a thing I think is not a real thing. I think there are maybe Christian and not Christian people. I think maybe that's a thing. But what I've often said that I think is helpful language is that the word Christian, when applied to anything other than a human being, is a marketing term.
Yeah.
It cannot mean what we mean for it to mean when we talk about people. It can't mean that when we talk about stuff, when we talk about education, when we talk about retail stores, radio stations, theme parks, music, breath mints. The term Christian cannot mean inherently right, true, good, beautiful, redeemed, saved. It can't mean that when applied to anything other than people, soulless things. It can't mean that. And so there's no such thing as Christian music, but that's what I was doing for all that time. So there's that added layer of weirdness about the fact that I was a professional Christian and then sorting out my personal practices in terms of, and you spend 10, 15, 20 years kind of watching the sausage get made and touring in churches and Christian festivals and dealing with the kind of the behind the scenes of the way that Christian practice kind of typically works. And you naturally start to get a little bit disenfranchised just a little bit, because just like you wouldn't probably eat as many hot dogs if you worked at a hot dog factory. And so,
right.
Because you kind of see what's going into that thing. And so, it was dealing with that and trying to maintain a personal faith and a personal practice, while also doing it in a public way all the time. So that was kind of the two layers always operating.
Do you think that kind of the PCA churches, especially Reformed theology, really likes to claim that they're like the academic version?
Yes.
Like they try to act like, and it's genuine. It's just, do you think was that appealing to you at the time? You really wanted to go deeper, and so that academic kind of understanding.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a an intellectual type. Like I'm definitely like I'm a raging Enneagram 5. I don't know if that means anything to you guys or anybody who's watching, but here in Nashville, like your mailman's Enneagram number. Everybody in Nashville,
it's a big deal here too.
Yeah, okay.
I'm a 7.
Oh, great. There you go. Gavin, what are you?
You know what? I'm the one rebel I'm the one.
Like, I'm not doing it.
Good for you.
Typical Gavin.
I'm in a group called the Liturgists here in San Antonio, which listens to the Liturgist podcast, and they're all about it. But I
be a moving target, bro.
I think they say I'm like an 8.
Okay,
but
I could see that. Yeah.
But
so I'm just like so I've always been a reader and a researcher and kind of data obsessed and information obsessed, and I want to know everything I can possibly know. And I think the way that I explain at this point in my life, no longer identifying as a believer, as an evangelical Christian, and I don't make that distinction to say that I am some other kind of Christian. I just don't. I'm just permanently uncertain about both unknowable and invisible things.
Sure.
Unknowable things like the future, invisible things like a God who has no form that we can see, literally. I'm just permanently uncertain about those things. And I don't have beliefs. I wouldn't put the weight of that word on anything, really. I have hypotheses that I test in real time, but nothing I would evangelize you guys on or try to, that I really feel that strongly about. But even when I was kind of identifying that way, I think I was looking back on it, if I'm honest, I think I was mostly just really into the intellectual side of assembling and almost like a Harley kind of tinkering with and working on my systematic theology as though it was a thing I'm always kind of in the garage working on and tightening up and hammering out and really having answers for just really everything. I loved to debate it when I was in my 20s and really anyone who gets into Reformed theology, it's really kind of an old joke that when you get into Reformed theology, you should lock yourself in your room for maybe 2 years and not talk to anybody because you're going to be an asshole for a little while. And that's just how it is.
I do want to pin the word certainty and uncertainty. I think that's really key in our discussion, and we can pin that for a little bit. I do want to go back to your journey. In around 2005 or 6, you came to Duke University Divinity School, and we introduced you at the time to John Howard Yoder and Stanley Hauerwas and kind of this pacifist understanding of Christianity, which also impacted you during that
Deeply.
time.
Yeah.
My one proud moment with Derek was getting him to read Stanley Hauerwas, and then when he wrote Mockingbird, as kind of a response to this kind of theology, I had to give it to Stanley Hauerwas, which y'all can Google him now, people who don't know, but he's an ethicist. Christian ethicist at Duke University.
Yeah.
And
he's world renowned. I mean,
there's like Hauerwasian theology, and it kind of comes from his mentor and maybe just personally he studied as John Howard Yoder, and with the book called The Politics of Jesus. Yeah, really great book. And you wrote that, and I was really nervous. I'd never really spoken to Hauerwas one-on-one. I went to his office, which is kind of in this castle, and I gave him the words and the CD and a burned CD, and
because we were wanting a quote from him, because I think we imagining the level of credibility it would
Yeah,
give to
I know.
have a quote on the back of a record from
Yeah.
Stanley Hauerwas.
Yeah,
a guy
and
who
when you
writes a
did
lot of
this,
book quotes, but never
people
an
were like
album.
blown away by it. But he had a couple of quotes that he turned in. One of them was that I can't remember the exact language, but he was like, I think he doesn't bullshit around, or like he's raw like the gospel. He doesn't bullshit around. We're like, oh, he can't really do that. So then he said something beautifully like, Derek Webb's music is free from pietistic sentimentality, which I really enjoyed, because a lot of Christian music was full of that. And I think he started his quote and he said, I hate Christian music.
Yes.
It was his like first line. But he really appreciated not only the CD that you put out before, but also Mockingbird, which we were trying to get him to comment on.
Yeah.
And that really was a big movement in your life for many years. So what was the breaking point past that said, you know what, I'm really kind of moving on? I think in the song, and Chad's going to ask you this in the song later, some words that you said when you kind of left the church and you left the faith.
Yeah, well, so I'm not going to let you off that easy in terms of the whole Duke Divinity thing, because, and I've said this to you before, but if I ever have a chance to say it publicly, I'm going to absolutely say it again and again, because that was a real pivot point. I mean, when I spent that time up there at Duke Divinity, and I was up there, and I remember exactly that time, but I was up there a few times, and you were usually the guy who was making that happen and pulling those strings behind the scenes to make that happen for me, and to invite me in, and to put me in some of those situations and introduce me to some of those people and some of those writings. And it was a huge turning point. I mean, for me, it really was. Like when I found my way into, some of that Christian pacifism and some of that kind of living the theology around living peaceably, and just there, and it pulled me so far out of where I had been. I'd been such a loyal kind of reformed kind of dude or whatever, but then I went looking for some of that theology on living peaceably. I went looking for it, and I could not hardly find any in the Reformed tradition. And so I did have to venture out into Mennonite tradition and a lot of other theology, and Yoder and so many other people whose books line my shelves now. And then wound up literally making 2 or 3 records in a row about these ideas. I became kind of obsessed with it, and it became really important to me for a long time. And it was one of those big inflection points. I feel like in my career, it really turned. It was a hard corner. I turned around. I had a lot to say about it once I started to study it and how important. And at a step, it felt like it was, especially with what was happening in the world at that time. I remember when after 9/11 and George Bush's government put out the new security strategy that outlined all the preemptive war and just all of that, unilateral preemptive kind of language that was a real turning point in terms of
it was a very interesting time to read Hauerwas and go through that.
It was
post 9/11 movement.
Yeah, that's right. And so as I was reading all that, it was and it just felt like the thing no one was really talking about was like, what is the church's response to this? And it's not what you think it might be. And it felt very out of step with everything that was going on, especially with the way that the church tended to and tends to anchor itself to nationalism in a way that I think is extremely unhelpful and unhealthy and unclear to people who are observing, where they're supposed to be, as I think it is, Hauerwas, resident aliens.
Sure, that was his first book with Will Willimon,
that's right.
the famous Methodist minister at Duke Chapel.
Yes, that's right. And so, the whole idea that the church is supposed to be a peculiar people, a strange, transcendent, out of step, it's like supposed to be it's supposed to be transcultural. It's supposed to be,
right.
It's not supposed to be anchored in any given time or place or particular culture or country. And yet the American church is so deeply anchored in nationalism. So I spent 2 or 3 records. I mean, became my whole thing for a handful of years.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that was huge, and I have you to thank for that. You were pivotal.
It's really Hauerwas. But another way to understand his theology, other than pacifism, which he's kind of known for, is also this communal theology, where he believes that the Christian church, like you said, is an alternative community. We're not a part of it. It's kind of like a Reinhold Niebuhr understanding too. Like it's this alternative lifestyle.
Yes.
and then it kind of it opens up to be more inclusive to things that the church wasn't inclusive to, whether it's the LGBT movement or other countries and other perspectives of Christianity, Eastern Christianity, all these other kind of things. In American Christianity, we shut out.
Yeah.
So,
which I really appreciated, I mean, it was,
So Chad has a question about one of your songs.
Sorry,
and
I think
it
to
feeds
dodge
in
the second half of your question, but I think maybe Chad's going to take us there,
Yeah.
so I won't worry about it.
Well, I mean, first off, it sounds like Pastor Gavin was part of the process of Derek walking away from the church. So way to go, Pastor.
Thanks.
That's it.
I'm gonna get.
No way,
I already
dude.
get accused of a bunch of other stuff.
You know what? That actually those were two totally detached seasons, like 10 years apart. So,
Yeah, they
Okay.
So no,
I stayed.
Me coming into pacifism
I grew up Church
versus-
of Christ in Houston, Texas, and I wavered toward the Methodist Church, Episcopal Church, and kind of hovered around Duke theology. And I stayed there. I'm still kind of in this liberal, Hauerwasian understanding of Christianity. I think Derek moved on to that, and I'm curious to why he did. So you got that question in that song. I think it might tie into this.
Yeah, I mean, this song, it sounds like, so when was that? When was Duke?
Oh, that was probably 2004 to 2008.
So this is much later. This is 2017. So
Yes,
probably
exactly.
it's the song "Goodbye for Now,"
Yeah.
which I think you knew that's where we were going. But there was some lines in there. One where you were talking about you say, "I still believe in love, just like I believe in just war." And I
think
thought
it's
that was
possible, but maybe not anymore.
yeah, right. I thought that was an interesting kind of juxtaposition there, right?
Well, because I remember at the time working out this idea that I thought the idea of just war, it did make sense to me, and that was just honestly an Easter egg for guys like Gavin, that line. It just seemed clever to me because I remember thinking the idea of just war, it does make sense to me, but I'm not sure that made sense. Like the idea when it was being, when those principles were being put together, I think that maybe could have worked at some time, but not in the age of nuclear weapons, not in the age of, like, I don't know there's a version of just war that makes any sense in 2010, in 2008, definitely not in 2020. So I believe in it. I believe it's possible, but not anymore. And so that line being, I still believe in love like I believe in just war, I think it's possible, but maybe not anymore.
Yeah.
That was just for guys like Gavin.
Yeah, that's a Hauerwas would debate Paul Ramsey, who wrote a book called Just War. They were kind of like debate guys that would debate just war or pacifist Christianity, and they were both Christians. And Paul Ramsey believed that we follow Christ closely, and so therefore just war, our ability to go in and fight a war might be just because our cross to bear might be different than Jesus's. Hauerwas takes a more like imitation approach to Christianity and says, no, like, we are going to be pacifist just like Jesus sacrificed on the cross.
Yeah.
So that is something that, like, if you're moving from total war, there's just war, then there's pacifist Christianity. But I understand that. But tell us a little bit about that love comment, though. So I understand the just war thing. Tell us a little bit why you threw in love there.
Well, because that whole song is about, it's kind of that's the last song on the Fingers Crossed album, which is the first record I put out on the other side of a few big major life changes. One was going through a divorce, and the other was going through a total deconstruction of my evangelical Christian faith. And so basically everything that made me up to that time was dismantled.
Which is probably the line where you said of a man who burned the house down where he kept everything. Is that kind of wrapped up in that thought process?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of ownership of my side of the street, in a lot of what resulted in, this season of life. But the song Goodbye for Now was mainly kind of it was a song I wrote as a duet with the God who I had believed was there and I was no longer persuaded was. And that's why in the very last, the very end of the song, the last pre-chorus into the last chorus says, so either you're not real or I'm not chosen.
Right.
And maybe I'll never know. And either way, my heart's broken as I say goodbye for now. I'm trying to hold the space for it to be true and to be persuaded at some point. I thought I was Lazarus, and that turned out to be maybe the guy in the grave next to Lazarus. I'm still waiting to be called out, and I'm still apparently dead in a grave waiting. And there's nothing I can, I'm at God's mercy now as much as ever, even as I disbelieve in him. But at the very end of the song, it goes through this bridge section that talks about, I kind of hold the space. I throw it to my duet partner and I say, and yet you say, and then I say nothing and wait for him to sing. And I've sang that song maybe 200 times and he's never showed up yet to sing it. So I let that be silent for one chorus and then I come back in and say, and I sing my goodbye for now. And I think it's affecting. I think it's, and I'm not trying to be George Carlin and say, George Carlin famously said every night on stage, he said, if God's there, then, strike me down with lightning right here on stage and prove it to everybody. And he said, see, he isn't there, and this whole thing. I'm not trying to be, I'm not trying to be like that about it. But that's how the emotion really felt to me at the time, and that's, yeah.
And I think and if you look at the trends of people in the faith community, a lot of people are deconstructing their faith in various different ways. Some of them, take a lighter approach. Some people leave the faith in general, but we see this trend happening more and more. I think your voice is something the church needs to hear right now. I know you've been told that before, but what was the biggest, and you may not be able to tell me one, but what was in that time period, like the straw that broke? Like what was something that you said, I can't, I'm not really a part of this. What was, if you could sum it up to one or two things?
Yeah, it's hard to do.
Because I knew that would be hard to do.
No. Well, but I don't mind taking a shot. I mean, I think it's hard to do because it is something that, you spend 35 years building a thing and believing a thing and working your way through a thing and explaining a thing to yourself in your head all the time in the face of things that seem to run contrary to that thing. So every time you would see just the classic theodicy of, is God both good and powerful? Is he not good enough to exercise his power, or is he not powerful enough to do what he knows is good? And could that explain why all this terrible stuff's always happening? And then people say, oh, it's just free will. And I'm like, well, then that means, then why do we pray? Because if we're asking God to change things and to save us from things, but he does not, but our free will ultimately decides, and is really the decider, then that makes us God, because that means our will can usurp and can come up around and get God's plans all out of whack, because that's the unexpected, all-powerful thing, apparently, that can spoil all of God's plans. And that doesn't sound like a God worth worshiping, or the one that rang true to me, maybe from my Reformed perspective, but still. And so I think that, as you start to, especially I think going through hard things, I think if I had to say something briefly, I would say that going through all these hard things, and I think a lot of folks, you practice Christianity. It's true. It's called a practice. It's a thing we're practicing. But I think that all of these years of all these folks saying, that God's never going to leave you, and it's going to be that all of these things are here to comfort you, and all these people as Jesus' body, the church, are going to be here to comfort you and to go with you and to challenge you and teach you and help you and instruct you and all these things. It just turned out that after all of that rehearsal, after all that dress rehearsal, when it came to showtime, none of it really seemed to do what it was supposed to do. None of it really seemed to help, and none of those people really, it's what the church does. The church loves talking about radical repentance and radical confession, and they love to talk about those as ideas, but you start to actually radically repent and radically confess, and boy, they back off fast.
Yeah.
And so I had a moment where I just had the opportunity to kind of hit a reset button and say, well, what if I stopped my conclusion bias that maybe all this must be true, and just looked at it and thought, what of this do I need to be true for reality to make sense? And is any of this really necessary? And do I even really believe that I need saving from anything especially? What of the presumptions that I lean on to help me to make sense of the way the world works, what of those things are actually rooted in things that I need to maybe pull threads on and pull apart? And maybe without those presumptions, suddenly all the rest of this starts to kind of fall apart. And it was also things like having to go to my LGBTQ gay community friends, of which I had so many and written many songs and a lot of songs challenging the church on the way that they fumbled with their treatment of the gay community. And I found myself saying things like, I'm tired of going to my friends and saying, man, I love you, and I don't see anything wrong with from an anthropological or biological or any other kind of reason, even theological. I don't really find anything especially wrong with your lifestyle and your behaviors. But the Bible, I'm afraid, if it's telling me, if I'm going to believe what it says about itself and judge it by its own rules, and then I'm going to have to say that it's not giving me the space, the permission to say that certain things that you're saying or doing are okay. I think they're okay. Or another way to say it is, my friends of other religions, gosh, I wish Christianity wasn't such an exclusive thing. I wish Jesus hadn't said, I'm the only way. And if not through me, then you're not getting in. I wish that wasn't so exclusive. I wish I could say that great people who do great things from other religions with no respect to Jesus, that there was a place for them in whatever it is that's coming after. I wish I could say it, but I can't because the Bible won't let me because it's exclusive. And I started thinking, am I more tolerant or loving than God is somehow here? How am I the one who's apologizing for the God of love of all the universe, telling my friends, I wish I could tell them the Bible said it was okay, I love them, but so it was just so many things packed in that after a while I was like, you know what? I'm not sure that's necessary. I'm not sure any of this makes any sense to me and is really necessary for me to make sense of the world as I observe it. I'm going to start from zero and only add on stuff that I need as I go. And it's like, imagine aliens coming to Earth and just observing the way human behavior works, observing the way cultures work and society works. How long would it take them to get to the part where they said to themselves, you know what? Now I get why, apparently, I think how all this seems to make sense is that maybe there's a all-powerful and totally good otherworldly being who made all this, but to whom that all these people need to be reconciled because at some point they did something wrong that broke them in their DNA forever. Then he came down as himself and justified them. And if they believe on that guy, how long would it take an alien to come up with that being necessary to the narrative of human existence to make all this make sense? I'm not sure it would ever come up. And so I was like, do I really need this? Did I make this up, or did somebody make this up? I get why the idea of religion and myth is important to the survival of humans, and so it definitely makes sense to me from an evolutionary adaptive standpoint, but it just wasn't persuasive. It wasn't necessary anymore. And I don't really know what really kind of any other way to explain it other than that,
And please, people listening, and you can post your questions to us. I know we've talked a lot about a lot of things in the kind of leading up to this. We've talked about just war theory, and there's a few people kind of confused about the just war theory and pacifist Christianity. We don't want to get lost in those. Those are just two different views of how you understand war, not only in the Christian faith.
People can disagree and still be
so within
right,
Christianity,
together.
There's different ways to understand war, and we were just kind of talking about learning about those styles of thought within Christianity as we were growing up. But then mainly we're going to be talking about Derek Webb's transition from a Christian musician to now a non-believer and still a musician. And so that's what we're kind of talking about now. So Pastor Chad, you got any thoughts about what Derek was saying a bit earlier?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to dive into the just war passages.
Yeah, we don't need to go there much.
I would love to. Just
we can spend.
I just don't think we're going to go there. It is an interesting topic for me and something that I would love to eventually get into. Just because I am a vet. So I served in the Army. I went to Iraq twice. But that's really where definitely my first deployment, or a little bit my first deployment, my second deployment, I really started having kind of a I don't know, I guess a hard conversation with God. Do I believe this? Why do I believe this? There's a lot of religious infighting that's going on in this country, and then us there. And so I definitely kind of jumped into that thought process of what I believe here. And I grew up in the Assemblies of God, so Pentecostal, evangelical church. And, I'm no longer in that vein, I guess, of the Christian church. But that's definitely a conversation that I've essentially tabled for now, just because I'm like, I don't know that I'm ready to like dive into that for myself.
Yeah, I got you.
I think I lean much more pacifist than I ever thought I would, especially being, a former soldier. And so that it's almost like my wife and I are both vets. And so we look at each other and we're like, what what do we do with that? And at this point, I'm just like, well, I was there and I did it, and now I'm here. And so, we'll work through that. One of the questions I did have, as you were kind of talking through your moment, I guess, or your moments that kind of led to where you're at. So one of the things I know you went through, and I don't know a ton of your story. I know bits and pieces, and I know 30,000 feet, but not a bunch of it. I know like divorce was a big thing that happened in that moment, and I don't know how the church came around you in that or excommunicated you in that. But I was divorced. I am divorced, and remarried. And when I got divorced, I was in the AG church, and the Assemblies of God church, and it was like, honestly, that was my conversation with God on my second deployment. I just gotten divorced. I left actually 2 weeks after I got divorced. I left for Iraq, and I was like, man, people were telling me I'd lost my calling.
Sure.
God was done with me. And I remember yelling at God and being like, you literally used the guy named Saul that you renamed Paul to do all kinds of stuff for you. And I think he did worse things than get a divorce. What have I done to really anger you in this? And so is that part of the church handling of you through that process? Was that a big part of that? Beginning the questioning, or
That's a fair question. And here's what I would say. It was definitely really, let me first own my part and say, I did not make it easy for any of my friends during that time.
I didn't either. I absolutely didn't. Yeah.
So, and I always
most of it was my fault.
Yes.
I own that.
And so I always want to start by owning my part of it and saying, I don't blame any of my friends at that time for the way that they responded or felt like they had to respond. There were some people I do blame because and again, I'm using kind of codified language when I start using words like sin, because I don't really use words like that anymore.
Yeah.
I don't really know what that means to me anymore. But one person's sin does not afford an allowance for another person to sin against them with impunity, just because what they're doing is not as bad as what you did.
Yeah.
And so just because you do something really awful doesn't mean it's okay for everyone to sin against you. In other words, there was a song on the Fingers Crossed record that said, just because, and I won't quote it all the way because there might be some sensitive ears in our chat, but just because I screwed up doesn't make me a cross on which you can hang your sin and be forgiven.
Oh, come on.
And so that was kind of what I was going through at the time. So what I'm saying is, even though I did not make it easy, although I made it very difficult, I know it was complicated for how people would respond to me at that time. And I probably had a 90%, 95% friend turnover around that time, around my divorce. Almost all of that's been 5 or 6 years ago. Almost all of my community, almost all of my friends, other than I can count on one hand, are all people who I did not know 6 years ago.
Yeah.
But here's what I will say. So was that disappointing? Yes. Was it really hurtful and hard? Yes. Did I have some responsibility? Absolutely. But what I will say is that, and this is, I'm borrowing, I don't know if you guys know who Dave Bazan is. He's in a band called Pedro the Lion, and I've known Dave for a decade or so. And he said this great thing that I borrow all the time, which is that deciding that you don't want to go to church anymore, that you don't maybe want to be a Christian anymore, as a result of Christians practicing Christianity poorly is a terrible reason.
Right.
That is not a reason not to be a Christian, because Christians are bad at Christianity is an awful, because of course, that's like saying, I'm not gonna go through recovery because everybody in AA are drunks. It's that's why we're here. It's because we have problems and we're trying to get restored and healed.
Yeah.
So that's no reason. You gather a bunch of people whose only real thing in common they have coming in is that they're sinful need of a savior. Of course it's going to be a screwy bunch of people, and of course they're going to screw it up, and they're not going to love each other right, and they're going to. So I would never say that part of my eventually coming around to not being persuaded by the truth of Christianity anymore really had anything ultimately to do with how Christians treated me at any point.
Right.
And I think and when I've heard people talk about your leaving the faith, they sometimes flippantly say on Twitter or other social media is the best, right? They'll say, oh, he's just disappointed in this, or he's just mad at Christians in general that haven't supported the LGBT movement or haven't signed up on, haven't moved the way he's moved.
Yeah, if you're
so he was just tired of Christians, but it's
Right.
deeper than that for you. It's not really that.
Absolutely. Yeah, because I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, if you believe in absolute truth and that that exists, then anyone's particular practice of it, should have no bearing really on. It just means that some people are, either fearful or, there's so many reasons why people fail to love well. There's a lot of reasons why I do still in my life that I try to identify and work on, but I don't think that I don't see how that could really ever truly. I mean, I think people can get fed up and exhausted and just say, I'm just tired of making these excuses and trying to explain this to my friends. And the thing is, though, just because 99% of people are doing it incorrectly doesn't mean that that's the true version of something.
Right.
And I know that's a crazy statement because it's like, wait, are you saying that like maybe the vast majority of all Christians practice Christianity incorrectly? Sure, maybe.
Yeah.
I mean, huge groups of them in the United States do. Big mass groups of them do. So yeah, that's possible, and that's not a good reason to leave. So there was no part of my decision making for sure.
And it sounded like as you were explaining it and kind of walking through it just now, I didn't get that. I think my thought process was like it may be, and maybe you were already kind of walking down that path of like, what is this, or do I believe this? But what I heard from you, it almost sounded like, and I'm putting words in your mouth, so correct me, but that the interpretation of who God is, like how we have interpreted who God is or what God is, was the biggest question. Is like, wait, like our interpretation of this whole thing, like, is it real? Is it?
Yes.
Is that the thing?
Yep. And you know what? And I'm honestly, I'm really truly open still and really seeking still. And my wife.
Be careful what you say, Derek, because people will then say, "Oh, he's my new target," right? He's going to go out.
Bring it on. I mean, if it's, pray till your knees are bleeding. I receive it. I'll take it. And if it's real, I have to think that it's going to prove out. But what Chad is saying, what you're saying, Chad, I think is important, and I want to make sure and say, I am not closed off to the idea that. So what I used to always say, interestingly, this is a phrase that has really aged well with me. Back in my evangelical days of belief, I would say all the time, and I think I was saying it to be provocative, but I really mean it, that some gods deserve atheists. This is a thing I said one time, and it really stuck with me. I've said it a lot over the years. Some gods deserve atheists. Now, what I mean by that is, another way to say it is, sometimes you have to kill and dismantle a false god to find a real God. Sometimes you have to move a thing out of the way for the real thing to appear. And I am completely open to the idea that the version of God that I spent 30 years believing and building a life around, an identity around, and that very evangelical, very reformed God, which honestly, though, to me is the most logical reading of the whole scripture and harmonizing with itself and everything holding together in some way. That still, to me, my friends call me a reformed atheist. I'm not an atheist, by the way, but I hate all categories. I mean, if 10 people have 10 different definitions of the same word, stop using that word because it's not helpful anymore. And so I'm not going to let anybody put a tag on me like that. I wouldn't say I'm an atheist or an agnostic or any of that stuff, but I want to stay in the conversation in real time, all the time. But when I think about Christianity, that's still the version that makes the most sense to me. It seems to make the most sense. That said, maybe I needed to become an atheist to the God I had believed in order to reset the space and hold the space for a God who maybe is there. And I'm open to that being true. And I'm open even to being persuaded that what I believed previously could be true. I really am open, and so my wife is. We have different spiritual beliefs. She's actually the singer in a pretty popular Christian band, and I'm a huge fan of theirs, a huge supporter of theirs, and I love her. I love her bandmates. I love their band. I love their music. I promote it. And when I say uncertain, I don't just mean about Christianity. I mean about everything, which I kind of think is a healthy approach, because I don't think uncertainty is the enemy of faith. I think it is the prerequisite of faith.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I think when it comes to things that are, again, invisible and unknowable. And let me say, so invisible being like God, you can't see him. Now, yes, can you see the wind through the trees? Does it prove the wind's there? But you can't see the wind. Yes, I've heard all that. That's fine, sure. What I'm saying is, you cannot see God if he walked in the room. He's invisible. Okay. So invisible and unknowable, like the future. You can't know what's going to happen 5 minutes from now. Nobody does. You just can't know. And so when it comes to unknowable and invisible things, I think that uncertainty is the best way to go. And even if I come back into a belief in something like Christianity, I'm going to have to carry that uncertainty with me and keep very short receipts and reconstruct in real time, so that you don't wind up with this giant sweater and this little thread, and you pull the thread and the whole sweater comes off. Why are we even, but the point is, why are we even constructing?
Yeah.
And that we may have to someday deconstruct. Stop constructing, everybody. Hypothesize and test in real time. And if you're finding Christianity and belief in God to be true and ring true to you, and it's proving out with your experiences and your observation of the world, then continue following it and continue testing it. I think that's fantastic.
Yeah.
I think that a blind certainty is where you really get to where you stop coming into new information. You can't hear anybody anymore, and that's what's problematic.
Exactly. I think, and I've gotten to the point where we were talking about this the other day. 10 years ago, the 10-year-ago Chad doesn't the today Chad doesn't believe what I believed 10 years ago.
Which means you're healthy.
Which
you're
is
coming into new information. That's awesome.
Right. So right now I can't think that I've arrived, right? I'm still in that process.
You probably felt certain 10 years ago.
Exactly.
And now you're looking back on the stuff you were certain about, thinking, I can't believe I thought that then.
Yeah.
That alone proves you can't even agree with yourself.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess, and I saw your post the other day about hypothesis and kind of living in that realm. That I think it's Richard Rohr that talks about like the 3 boxes of belief, right? The fundamental belief, deconstruction, and then reconstruction. And his thought process is, hopefully we move into the reconstruction process where we're reconstructing something. And I think one of his statements with deconstruction is, if we get stuck in deconstruction and we're not reconstructing, then we just become cynics.
I totally agree with that. Yeah.
And okay, so that was when I read that hypothesis thing, I was trying to figure out so are we okay with being cynics, or what does that look like? I guess
I think cynicism is only helpful.
How would you differentiate that?
Yeah, I think cynicism is only helpful if it's keeping you close to real time in terms of not allowing your receipts to get long with your doubts.
Yeah.
But no, I would say so. Targets, the new record, is a 100% reconstruction record. It is a record about my reconstruction. It's about falling in love again, getting remarried, about finding my way into some things that I would not call belief, but that I'm testing and I'm hypothesizing. I'm moving back towards, and I'm not. See, I think that sometimes for Christians, they'll only call something reconstruction if it's you reconstructing Christianity.
Sure.
Yeah.
I'm fully reconstructed at this point. I don't have any big lingering questions, and I have a lot of hypotheses based on things that I've observed and read and thought long and hard about. It does not amount to anything remotely like Christianity. It does not involve Jesus. It does not involve God necessarily as a strict idea, especially as I read him in the Christian Bible. But I'm settled. I'm reconstructed. I just haven't reconstructed Christianity. So I think a lot of Christians that I've met would say, "Oh, you're still deconstructing." I'm like, well, so yet again, let's stop using these terms, because we have different definitions. We're not saying the same thing.
And we pinned this, and we've talked about it, so I don't want to dive in too much. And I want to get to Leonardo's question here. Sure. And that's been my struggle. Where I connect with Derek in this story is just being frustrated, not so much with Christians that don't get it right? I'm not trying to individualize it, or even within certain groups of Christianity, but overall, the church in the last, the church I've been a part of in America has been so certain. Yeah. And especially in the last 10 years, certainty has become a proud, if you're not certain, you really don't have faith at all.
Right.
And really, there's times of Christianity where uncertainty was the healthiest thing. Like you said, it was this journey that led you.
It allows you to bend without breaking,
Yeah. And I think that's where where I find myself now is living in an uncertainty, but still allowing the teachings of Jesus to lead me, right? It can still guide my way.
You know, and I think that requires mystery and faith and all the things that evangelical Christianity is supposed to be. A mystic religion.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, that's, you were at the talk with Rob Bell when he talked about Kadash.
Sure.
Like holy, holy, holy. And he said basically like the early church, like the idea was like they were fine with living in the mystery.
Sure.
Like that, the whole point of holy was it's mysterious. It's like we don't understand it, so we can live in that mystery.
I mean, even if you do the rosary as a Catholic, it's mystery, right? Like it's a mystery of how Christ even died and was resurrected. Like, so certainty is really not a Christian word to me, and I think that's a lot of the like probably your heartache there, maybe, and I think that's a lot of heartache for a lot of people, all on the spectrum of trying to figure out where we've been and where we kind of are going as a people of faith. And I'm think
glad you
pastors,
said that, Gavin, because I think it's important for people to hear that you can do it that way. You can practice Christianity and hold the uncertainty with it. You can. You absolutely can. In fact, I think that's the best.
And you should do that to all religions. If you're a Buddhist, you should hold some uncertainty. You should still live mindfully. If mindfulness is your thing, then you can still hold uncertainty and still practice mindfulness. I don't know why that wouldn't be true to Judaism. Many of my Jewish friends actually are brilliant in doing this, living in uncertainty, but still
never
practicing.
Be so certain that you are now you're no longer allowing reason to get in anymore, and you're not like where you're just like no, I don't want to, that disaster, it's too complicated. Nope, I'm just certain, just let go and let God, and I'm just certain, and I don't want to talk about complicated things. I want to talk about how God is allowing these really awful things to happen and somehow using them for his glory and our good. And that's mysterious. And, like, I think that certainty, that's where it can become toxic. That's where it can become a poison in the water, is when it keeps you from thinking critically about the whole thing and keeping short receipts. I think it's really important to do.
No. And I will say this one thing. I think that Christian pastors with a lot of power have caused this certainty to kind of like spread through all the people who follow these pastors. And so I will put a little bit more pressure on church leadership that have really in the last 30 to 40 years, and heck, the last 4, was just people's allegiance to either a certain type of politic. And I grew up listening to Focus on the Family. This thing was boiling since the 80s. And I will put a little pressure on pastors that teach this type of certainty, where then good people say, wow, it's good to be certain, because I that's where I find my core value of faith, and I can understand faith better if it's certain. Well, that kind of boils up into really bad places. So I will put a lot of pressure on pastors and clergy who continue to rage in this certainty. And I really think maybe is one of the main reasons people are leaving the church. So I do want to get to a question from a good friend from Chad, Leonardo Torres. Tell us a little bit about Leonardo. I know you've spoken to him before, right?
Yeah, Leonardo Torres. He's got a YouTube channel that has kind of blown up in the past like month and a half. But what he's done, he does reaction videos to Christian songs as a non-Christian, and so
you would love this, Derek.
It sounds like I would love it.
So
I didn't know if Derek heard of it or not.
But the interesting
for him to review my song "The Spirit Bears the Curse." If he has not heard it, I would love for him to not listen to it and react to it. On
He's going to go listen. He's Googling it right now.
Yeah, for sure. I think he'd love it.
To do that. Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
The hard part is if YouTube will allow it to happen, or I guess your publishing company if they'll allow it to.
I hate that. Anyway, so go ahead. So tell us.
But yeah, so Leonardo has done quite a few, and he's done like a bunch of the Hillsong songs and stuff like that, and he'll talk about. And I actually did an interview with him a while back, and he refers to God as like the Great Spirit, and just like, he's got a I don't know what to call it now. I can't call it belief because Derek said I can't call it belief, but
you can call it anything.
I'm just kidding. Yeah,
I don't call anything.
Yeah,
I belief.
Yeah, he's got a belief there, but he does have a great question for you, and I think, and I hit him up. I was like, hey, I think you would enjoy this conversation. So, thanks for hopping over, Leonardo. But he did have a question, and I can't see it now.
Oh, he says, Derek, what do you think about Stoicism?
Stoicism,
Stoicism.
I would
Stoicism,
love.
yeah.
I would do ironically what I think Jesus would do, and I would ask a follow up.
Yeah, of course. Jesus.
I would ask him to define that for me.
Okay.
Because I'm not going to answer a question about a term that we might and probably have different definitions for.
Sure.
So
Good question. It's challenging, Leonardo.
No, it's that's what Jesus would do. He would ask.
No, that's good. So
Yeah.
if you
What was
post
it?
a follow-up question.
There's a book. So actually, that book right there on the top is called "Jesus is the Question," and it's the 302 questions Jesus asked, and the 307 questions Jesus asked, and the 3 he answered. And so
what I will say is
he was good at it.
That of the Stoicism writings that I've read, I've had a ton of friends send me a bunch of stuff on the Stoics, and I actually resonate a lot with it. I really resonate. I mean, with what is classically thought of as Stoicism. Not, I think people think of Stoic and Stoicism. It's like kind of emotionless and kind of, or whatever the thing is. But I've resonated a ton with all the Stoics that I've read, actually. And I had a buddy get me on one of these daily email deals where you get some writings from classic Stoic writers or writings, and I actually loved a bunch of it. I thought it was great. So anyway, but I would be curious I would always rather somebody take that big loaded term and break it apart into about 50 little small questions and terms, and let's talk about all those things. Some of those got to get broken up again. Bob Dylan is one of my absolute heroes and has been I learned almost everything from Bob Dylan. And there's this great documentary called Don't Look Back, and it's made by D.A. Pennebaker, and it's made in 1964, I think, and it was in Dylan's second trip to the UK after his first trip to the UK, maybe a year or two before. He was a nobody. He was just getting started in the UK, and then between then and this documentary, he comes back to the UK and he's a huge star. Times They Are Changing is a #1 hit on the radio, if you can imagine that. And he was a huge star, massive people at the airport and everything. And there's this great, everyone should watch it. I mean, whether you're a Bob Dylan fan or not, because it's incredible, fly on the wall, full access to Bob and backstage, on stage. And there's this great moment where somebody, I think from Time magazine, is interviewing Bob about his performances and Times They Are Changing. And he asks him this question, and basically Bob spends the entire, and this is a 23-year-old Bob Dylan, just to show you how brilliant he was, how early, basically spends the entire 20-minute interview berating this guy and making him define every single word in his first question. He never even answers it, and he never gets to his second question. He basically, makes him define, well, but what is folk music? What is a protest? Who are my fans? And what do you mean? Like he takes literally, he says, I'm not going to answer that question until you define every single word in it, or else I have no idea what you're really talking about, and you will completely misread and misquote me in every way because we're not even speaking the same language. And it's this great moment. It's something I learned from Bob Dylan is never answer a question until both parties have signed off on definitions for every single word. Especially big words like that, loaded.
When Derek came to do the house show at the ranch, I asked his road manager at the time, I think his name was Dave. I might be wrong. Yeah. And, I said, what's it been like? I think they were driving from Lubbock or something. And, he said, we've been listening to Bob Dylan the entire time.
And that's literally been true this week. He never goes out of style.
In our final 10 or so minutes here, maybe we could stretch it a little bit. You just recorded an album for the United Methodist Church, right? It's a children's curriculum.
Yes, it
is. I think there's a single, I guess you call it a single. It's on YouTube called Brave and True. Do I have that right?
Kind and Brave.
Kind and Brave.
Yep.
And it was put out, and you kind of announced to everyone that you worked with the Methodist Church. And I didn't know Derek was about to do this. And all of a sudden, my text was blowing up about Methodist pastors, and they were like, hey, Derek, what's going on here? And I guess some people in the Methodist Church were upset that a non-believer, would participate in curriculum building for a church. And I found that debate interesting because I've worked for churches that have had huge orchestras and organists, and being a believer was never
musicians
was never a prerequisite of actually joining and participating in that music. But I think the crutch for them was the curriculum side of things. And Derek obviously defended himself as he would. But tell us a little bit about that project, some of that controversy, and what that meant to you. You grew up United Methodist. Obviously, your wife was involved as well. Tell us about that, and what I think it's coming out this fall.
It's coming out in the next month, I think, or so.
Okay.
And so the project's called Celebrate Wonder. And it basically, so I grew up, as we've talked about, I grew up in the United Methodist denomination. I'm very familiar with that. And the United Methodist Publishing House here in Nashville reached out to me, a year and a half ago, and said that every handful of years, they refresh all of their curriculums. And the publishing house here in Nashville are the folks who oversee all of that, the writing and distributing of all that curriculum to the United Methodist Church globally. And so they said that they'd gone through a series of meetings and to decide who they wanted to handle the music side, the soundtrack side of the new curriculum, and that I was their first choice somehow. And I was obviously just immediately really super honored by that. And I, as I mentioned before, followed up with a question and just said, just want to make sure that they were up to date with me. Like, have you heard my last record or so? Are we?
Yeah, Caedmon's Call, right?
Yeah. And they actually came back and said that they had heard Fingers Crossed. It was before Targets came out. And that they loved that record, and that the person who had written the curriculum that mine would be replacing was actually an Orthodox Jewish man in New York who didn't believe in Christianity, and he had written the previous curriculum that mine was going to be replacing. He just apparently wasn't on Twitter.
Yeah, he wasn't on Twitter or didn't have any.
So that's the difference.
Wasn't it a Christian band?
Yep, that may be the difference. And so, but they said that they liked the way I wrote lyrics, and they liked the ethic by which I described the world, and kind of the way I approach songwriting and the way I write. And they wanted to have a meeting about it. So we met and we had some conversations, and I definitely had concerns about exactly what did happen on social media when we announced the project. I knew people would be confused by it, but it's the kind of confusion I kind of like, because I like to be a moving target. I don't like for people to, I didn't want all the atheists or agnostics to suddenly think I was their guy, because I'm not their guy. I'm not anybody's guy. I don't have a fixed point of view about this. I'm always looking at the world and describing it as an artist from that real-time perspective all the time. And those variables are constantly changing. Both me and the world are constantly changing. So I don't put my flag down anywhere. I keep moving, and I try to do my work honestly and vulnerably. And so after discussing it with them, and also to be fair, discussing the amount of oversight they were going to have, which was important to me, that they had a lot of oversight, that I was really more a tool in their hand to get what they needed, that I was ultimately serving them and serving their purposes and what they needed this music to accomplish.
Sure.
Because they're my client. I mean, I'm a freelancer at that point. And so I'm a composer for them. And so I want them to get what they need out of the project. So after some conversations about it, I was very comfortable with the team. We had a great mutual respect. And so we proceeded, and it was actually amazing. And the thing that social media is terrible about is nuance. And so no one wants to really hear, and it's hard to even communicate, and maybe not even appropriate to communicate all of the justification and how it works. And but they were extremely involved. They gave us very detailed, a ton of detailed stuff that we were basically putting together jigsaw puzzles. I mean, I was not myself writing anything. My wife and I were writing the songs based on Bible stories, specifically on certain topics. There were 12 units, and each unit had a song, and there was one theme song, and they were super specific about what they wanted it to communicate, and I was serving them, and I was just, and it really helped. It didn't require my belief any more than my friends in town who are professional songwriters, and they spend all day writing country music. They didn't grow up on farms. They're not country people. They don't live in, some of them don't live in the South. It's not required that you are a farmer to write a country song. It's not required. And I have a lot of friends who write Christian songs who are not Christians either. They are just professional songwriters who understand that language and can put those songs together. So for me to do this work, I thought, I'm very familiar with this language. It's something I'm pretty schooled in and I'm very comfortable with. I knew these stories pretty well. And it sounded like just a really fun challenge, a project my wife and I could work on together. So we wrote all the songs. They made meticulous notes. We made sure that they were really guided specifically by the curriculum. Now, there's a lot of clever poetry in it, but the messages are very anchored to the curriculum that they wrote and provided to us. But then they let us record it in the, and make it sound. We played every instrument on it, and we recorded the whole thing here, and so it feels like a record of mine. I mean, my wife and I sang all the songs, and we made it right here in our studio, and I love it. My kids sang on it. I played it for my children because it's for kids in their age group, and to see if it was fun to sing, and if it communicated. And so it was a really challenging and fun project. They were great to work with. I'm really proud of it. But it was caused a stir. I can't wait to hear it. It caused a stir when we announced it, for sure.
Yeah.
Hey, I got one final question for you, and I'm going to try to. At 9:00 we have somebody else coming into the studio, I believe, right?
Yep.
So we have to get kicked out. But and it's 10:00, and is it 9:00? What time is it in Nashville? It's your Central Time.
It's almost 9 here. Yeah.
It's Central time. Knowing you as best as I can, when it comes to your faith in the community that you probably still would like to be a part of, I'm not even talking about Christianity, just a community of thinkers, of believers, of non-believers. Is there a community out there that you could see yourself being a part of? Is there a church, you could say, I hate to use that word, but a community, a congregation, a parish, you could say different things, that you would feel comfortable being a part of? Because at my church, at Travis Park Church, it's the United Methodist congregation as of now. We don't know where it's going here because of the Methodist split. Right. But there are people in our church who would consider themselves just like you, Derek, like not totally uncertain. They could maybe use the word atheist or agnostic or somewhere in between, or they don't like labels, but they're not buying into the whole thing. But they still participate in the community because of that uncertainty and that mystery and maybe the teachings of Jesus or whatever they find compelling. Is there a community that you could see yourself a part of and maybe find more of a like-minded faith?
Well, so I'll start by saying I just don't know. So the church is good at congregating. The church is great at congregating, bringing people around ideas and mission. I mean, the church is really good at it. So when you find yourself on the other side of the church, not participating or believing in that same way anymore, what you don't realize is you're brushing past the congregants of your new view of reality, but there is no congregation for people. So the church, if you imagine the church as a sponge is always holding a little water, but a lot more water has moved through the sponge than is in the sponge at any given time. The church is like that. It is a lot more people have come through it and moved through it and have come before it and then have then left it than are in it at any given time. That's what's fascinating about it. So it's turned out congregations on congregations of people that are no longer congregating because they can't find each other, because there is no central idea around for any of us to congregate around. So part of me is like, I don't really feel any need to congregate around the way I see the world or the way that I think about reality to make it make sense. I'm not sure I really need friends who that's all we're doing, or that's the only reason we're congregating. Sure. My friends and I, my wife and I and our friends.
Is she in the room with you?
She's not. I'm kind of pointing kind of downstairs.
I didn't want to be rude.
No, she's downstairs. But, our friends, we have friends who are all over that spectrum, all over that map. Friends who are very post-belief, who are squarely, solidly believers. We have friends who are uncertain on both ends of that. And so for me at this point, I really like that not being a filter or layer on the intention of congregating that I'm doing with anybody. Because everybody is somewhere, everybody has some opinion, has some worldview, a grid through which they look at reality to help them make sense of what they're seeing. Everybody has it, even if it's the grid of disbelief and chaos, that's still a grid. And we all have it, and we all discuss our grids. It's not the reason we're there, that's not what we're there to talk about, but we talk about that stuff with a lot of our friends. It's not a prerequisite. So I don't really see the need to do it, really. But that said, I definitely am interested in the future of the church. I think it's an incredibly important institution, cultural institution, political institution. And as again, my buddy Dave Bazan would say, that kind of still feels like my people and my community, and I know a lot. I'm much more familiar with that language than I am any other language. So I would feel more at home around a bunch of Christians and be able to speak their language with them than I would feel around anybody else. And so my wife and I actually have visited. There's a church here in Nashville that, because I do want to hold the space, and I don't want to close myself off from hearing people doing good things and behaving in ways that do seem consistent with the following of Jesus as I understand him. And so we looked around for a long time, and Lord knows there's a church on every corner in Nashville, but we found one that kind of described themselves as a kind of a place for spiritual refugees and kind of folks who have kind of fallen out of various ends of the church or whatever. And they're very welcoming to everybody, radically welcoming, kind of like your church is. And that's like a real point of pride for them. And so we tried to look for a spot that we felt seemed like ethically they were identifying themselves parallel to the way Jesus, the things that seemed to matter to Jesus and how radical his love seemed to be in the way he practiced it. And we've gone there, and we actually have visited there more than a handful of times. And we go there. We obviously haven't been there in months because of quarantine, but before that, we were going most weeks. Most Sundays we would go because we just want to hear what they're saying and how they're saying it. And we want to see if that rings true. And if there's a point at which it does seem to ring true again, I want to make sure if there's a point at which I'm somehow ready for it, I want to make sure I'm hearing it. And so we do. Yes, we do. And they seem like good people. They seem like they're gathering for good reasons. It's a real motley crew, and I like that. And I think I would probably come and hang out at your church.
I will say to you, and I'm just not saying this, is that your voice is needed. Like, as a pastor, I want voices like yours in any type of community.
I thought about going to the minister there and asking if they would ever consider having a minister of deconstruction. And let me come be on staff and be the guy who gets to come into the meeting and actually walk in as the non-believer, ready to talk you through, along with another pastor, like how to process grief.
I love that. I love that.
Hey, to be fair, we had the Quakers. Right before COVID dropped, we had the Quakers come and share at, and you would be a great Quaker because they believe in this kind of uncertainty, right? They're kind of open to a lot of different beliefs. But the only problem that Derek and I would have, I think they're supposed to sit in silence most of the time.
And that's no fun.
You could worship like 60 minutes and just no one speaks. I don't think would be bad at that. But I think the general premise of being a Quaker is great.
I'm into it.
Well, Derek, we have to go because there's another Facebook Live coming on. It's actually his wife. She's amazing. And Derek Webb, everybody, again, thank you for sticking with us. If you first listen to that first 20 minutes, you're probably, what the heck are they talking about? But Derek Webb, his new album, Targets. That's how it be. We jumped in so fast.
You guys just went so deep so quick.
Yeah, we made that mistake.
This is awesome. Kind of like, I don't have another gear.
Just go.
Yeah.
I loved it.
Well, really check out his new album, Target. You can the very first comment is the link to watch that concert tomorrow. So I'll check it out, Derek.
Tomorrow. Yeah, I'd love to
I'll be on there.
All right. Well, come back anytime. We'll talk more. Sorry for the time limit, but
no, it's so great. A pleasure. Thank you guys so much for holding the space and letting me say all of that to these people and with you guys. I appreciate it. I would love to talk more for sure.
And Derek, we're praying for your soul. Okay. I just want you to know that we're praying for your soul.
Please do.
I love you, Derek.
Okay,
thanks so much. Thanks for Pastor Chad, the Arsenal Church, everybody.
Thanks, Derek.
Bye.
Okay. See you guys.
Yeah, that's it. We're done. I think we're going to hit this in broadcast.
Yeah, that's it.